Leary, who spoke about his book recently. So this is hopefully you'll still learn something new about the Battle of Algiers. I know it's been talked about a lot, but
Would
all
you
right.
do you have a PowerPoint that you were going to be sharing?
I do, yes.
Okay. I am just it's advanced sharing options, is that correct, Mohammed?
I, I believe so.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I believe John can go ahead and share screen, and we can all view it. You have
Okay.
that option, right, John? Just wanted
Now
to
I do,
confirm.
yes. Give
Yeah, you do.
me
Okay,
just
Okay,
great. Sorry about that.
sounds great.
okay. Sorry, I just have to allow Zoom to share the screen real quick.
Take your time, no worries. Just wanted to
Just
take a
again.
moment and, welcome everyone here today. We have a lot of participants today, so thank you for being here, everybody. Very happy to have you.
And sorry, normally it just allows it, but it's giving me some issues now.
Um, okay.
All right, I think I got it.
So
So
Mohammed,
it's
Nicole, could you go ahead and make John the host?
yeah,
If
I
you
was
do that,
gonna ask you, do I go that through participants?
yeah, through participants, beside John's name, you should be able to see like a blue.
can
Okay.
you see it now? Is it
Oh,
sharing
yes,
now?
we
Yes.
do. We do.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it. Okay,
Sorry,
great.
my word reference has been here. Okay. All right, are we good?
Yes, it looks
Awesome.
This is
beautiful.
good, John. This is good.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. All right. So with this dissertation, I am tracing the history of the international activities of the Algerian film industry from its pre-revolutionary roots to the dissolution of its major film institution and the end of the government monopoly in the mid 1980s. After achieving independence in 1962, Algerian film culture flourished. One of the most interesting and understudied phenomena of the Algerian film industry were the prominent co-productions that the industry undertook with those of other Mediterranean nations, and these co-productions constitute the subject of this presentation. First, though, a brief explanation is in order regarding why internationalism and Algerian foreign policy are salient historical lenses through which historians can analyze the activity and development of the Algerian film industry. First, it is hard to overstate the extent to which internationalization was an important guiding principle in the Revolutionary Wartime playbook of the Front de Libération Nationale, or FLN. The quote, internationalism of the Algerian problem was itemized as the FLN's top external objective in initial wartime directives in 1954, and this principle was tenaciously adhered to for the duration of the war. The FLN's clandestine newspaper, El Mujahid, featured countless articles touting the internationalization of the struggle. The FLN adroitly navigated Cold War geopolitics by waging a sophisticated diplomatic campaign in high circles in Washington, while also receiving arms from Eastern Bloc nations. These principles extended into the post-independence period as the FLN transformed from an insurgency to the governing party of Algeria. In the Algiers Charter, the document that spelled out the FLN's ideological principles for governance, there are 8 points made that lay out the party's approach to international relations. The seventh point puts forth a policy that implies tolerance toward Western governments and modes of life. Quote, the coexistence between states, the Charter proclaims, with different economic systems with different economic and social systems is ideal. Most of the Charter's points on international relations, however, reveal a firm dedication to the support of independence movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the indictment of imperialism, both in its overt colonial and subtle post-colonial forms, is the most prevalent theme in the governing FLN's official approach to international relations. And, of course, an uneasy internationalism colored Algeria's relationship with France, whose post-colonial tendrils continued to extend themselves into the Algerian economy. Though the Algerian War was waged in the name of strict nationalism, the FLN ensured that an understanding of its aims and claims transcended national boundaries. maintaining a foreign policy that exhibited steadfast promotion of revolutionary principles tempered by a tolerance of most systems of government, provided that those systems did not engage in imperialist activity. Next, the very entities that waged the successful revolution for independence subsequently controlled Algeria's film industry, thereby extending certain revolutionary tenets into its management, internationalization included. Though the FLN did not rule with the same totality as Eastern Bloc communist parties, it nevertheless exerted powerful control over the Algerian film industry. President Ahmed Ben Bella nationalized the film industry in 1964. After his ouster in 65, President Houari Boumediene, after Ben Bella's ouster, in 1965, President Houari Boumediene exerted even tighter control over the film industry when, in 1968, the Ministry of Information was granted far-reaching powers in appointing industry personnel. Other high-ranking cabinet members were placed on an advisory board, or Conseil Consultatif, overseeing the direction of the film industry. At the significant 1969 Pan-African Cultural Festival held in Algiers, Boumediene opened the festival by saying, quote, "Culture is a weapon in our struggle for liberation." Despite these nationalist moves, the Algerian film industry was permitted to integrate itself into global film culture more generally, in keeping with the principle of internationalization. Accordingly, the Algerian film industry imported many international films for domestic exhibition and submitted films to prestigious international film festivals, just as it undertook international co-productions with European and Arab nations alike. With this research, then, I aim to expand on these accounts by tracing the historical drivers, circumstances, and consequences of Algerian international co-productions across a range of industrial and political contexts. Using the case studies of the Battle of Algiers, an Italian co-production, Z, a French co-production, and The Sparrow, an Egyptian co-production, and drawing from archival materials found in the Museo Nazionale del Cinema in Turin, as well as the Centre Culturel Algérien and the Cinémathèque Française in Paris, I will argue that Algeria planned co-productions with filmmakers whose previous bodies of work demonstrated a track record of ideological commitments consonant with the Arab nationalism and anti-colonialism championed by the Front de Libération Nationale. I will go on to make the following historical arguments regarding Algerian international co-productions. A, they deployed their textual makeup as a subtle means of promoting ideological views on international affairs that were consonant with that of Algerian nationalism. B, they provided key training opportunities for Algerian filmmakers and technicians. And C, they not only infused revenue into the Algerian film industry, but also lent it a more ineffable quality of international prestige, a quality constantly sought after by the FLN during the revolution itself. In the conclusion, I'll remark briefly upon Algerian film professionals' critiques of these co-productions. Ever since the achievement of independence in 1962, the Algerian film industry has been closely tied to the nation's government. 1963, the first full calendar year of Algerian independence, witnessed the first maneuvers to nationalize elements of the film industry. In the city of Blida, an exurb of Algiers, movie theaters formerly owned by Europeans were placed under state ownership. The following year, President Ahmed Ben Bella nationalized the rest of the country's exhibition halls. Production would soon follow suit. It is ironic, then, that some of the earliest and most prominent international co-productions were undertaken not by centralized governmental offices, but instead by Casbah Film, the sole private production company to exist in Algeria in the immediate aftermath of its independence. Nevertheless, Casbah Film had as its director Sadi Youssef, a figure who could not have been more central to the mythos of the FLN's bid for independence. Toward the end of 1956, the action of the Algerian War had bled from the rugged mountains and barren deserts of the Algerian countryside into urban centers. The most violent and dramatic occurrence of urban warfare occurred during the Battle of Algiers in 1957. Youssef was the leader of a vast cell of FLN revolutionaries in what was called the Algiers Autonomous Zone, and he orchestrated the infamous retaliatory bombings of European centers of leisure. He was apprehended by the French military and sentenced to death in August of 1957, but was spared the guillotine when de Gaulle commuted all capital sentences upon coming to power in May of 1958 after the collapse of the Fourth Republic. After his release from prison following independence, Youssef quickly turned to filmmaking. Before the Battle of Algiers, Youssef inaugurated Casbah Film with a collaboration with Italian director Ennio Lorenzini on a short Eastman color documentary entitled Les Mains Libres. In a testament to the Algerian government's involvement in private film enterprise before the formation of state institutions, government officials persistently attempted to place the film in competition at the 1965 Cannes Film Festival. Production on the Battle of Algiers began later that year, with Italian filmmaker Gillo Pontecorvo attached to direct. To realize a project on this particularly dramatic episode of the war, the Algerians reached out to several Italian filmmakers. According to correspondence from Pontecorvo to his lawyer concerning the revocation of his visa to enter France, which Pontecorvo suspected to be politically motivated, the Algerians approached both Luchino Visconti and Francesco Rosi to helm the Battle of Algiers. In a testament to Casbah Films' desire to place the project in the hands of a radically inclined European filmmaker, both Visconti and Rosi had engagé films to their credit. Visconti's La Terra Trema remains the neorealist classic most inflected by Marxism, and Rosi's Hands Over the City indicted the same brand of Western corporate greed that the Algerian government regularly condemned. Pontecorvo's filmography reveals similar anti-fascist and anti-imperial leanings as that of his similarly courted contemporaries. What's more, certain patterns of representation in Pontecorvo's previous films illustrated his capability in handling the visualization of the expansive and violent events of the Battle of Algiers itself. In an echo of La Terra Trema, Pontecorvo's 1957 film La Grande Strada Azzurra depicts an impoverished fisherman's attempts to break loose from the grips of powerful fishmongering syndicates and strict governmental authorities alike. Several scenes depicting the controversial practice of fishing with underwater detonations anticipated Pontecorvo's subsequent handling of the infamous milk bar bombings in the Battle of Algiers. With 1960's Capot, Pontecorvo made one of the first films to represent Nazi wartime atrocities in graphic detail. Again, the film's depiction of crowd violence and authority figures indifferent to mass suffering gave him experience in dramatizing the sort of tableau that would be crucial in successfully executing filmic representations of the Battle of Algiers' many violent episodes. But it may be an unrealized film that best illustrates Pontecorvo's suitability for leading Yassef's project. Just as he had been one of the very first filmmakers to confront the Holocaust head-on in Capot, so did Pontecorvo exhibit early interest in representing the Algerian conflict in an unrealized project entitled Barat, a term denoting elite French paratrooper forces who tried to stamp out the FLN in the tight labyrinth of the Algiers Casbah. Full-typed treatments for Barat can be found in both the Pontecorvo papers at the Museo Nazionale del Cinema in Turin, as well as the archives of the Cinémathèque Française. With Franco Cristaldi attached to produce and actors like Peter O'Toole approached to star, Pontecorvo wrote out a detailed treatment for Barat. Correspondence from June of 1963 indicates that the production had been delayed and the film was ultimately canceled. Surprisingly, the narrative of Barat seems to indict French colonialism even more scathingly than the Battle of Algiers, which, despite its obvious sympathy for the cause of Algerian independence, takes on more of a reportage tone. The treatment follows a French soldier named Paul, who assists in the organized torture of a suspected FLN revolutionary. The planned film would have ended with Paul encountering this man 5 years later, towards the end of the war. Pontecorvo planned this Algerian character to have been driven to insanity and pauperdom, leaving Paul with a profound sense of guilt and distress. Within the planned story of Barat, the OAS, or Organisation Armée Secrète, takes on a position of villainous prominence. In the final years of the Algerian War, the OAS was a clandestine paramilitary group formed by far-right Pied Noirs and French military deserters who were demoralized by President de Gaulle's openness to Algerian self-determination. As Algeria inched ever closer to achieving independence in 1962, the OAS, which is more or less absent from the Battle of Algiers, desperately attempted to maintain Algérie Française through widespread terror campaigns designed to paralyze urban centers. On top of the engagé qualities of La Grande Strada Azzurra and Capot, the plot details of Barat could be offered as proof to the Algerians that Pontecorvo was undaunted in tackling filmic representations of French excesses in Algeria, including the institutionalized use of torture and clandestine pro-colonial far-right terrorism alike. Contracts between Casbah Film and the Italian Igor Film reveal the nature of Battle of Algiers as an international co-production on a more granular level. Yassef's producer counterpart for Igor Film was Antonio Muzu, who had worked as a production manager on Capot. Shooting was slated to begin at the end of October or the beginning of November in 1965 and was scheduled to last for 12 weeks. Several of the contract's clauses state that Mosou and Pontecorvo were to collaborate closely with Yasef in the selection of costumes and filming locations, as well as the hiring of actors and technicians. There are several moments in the Battle of Algiers that speak to the independent government's foreign policy stances. These occasionally take the form of voiceovers, in which FLN directives announce the importance of United Nations recognition for the legitimization of their cause. A particularly telling moment, though, occurs when reporters approach Colonel Mathieu, a military officer tasked with crushing the FLN's Algiers cell. Can you all hear the clip okay?
I can't hear it, but I can get it. Okay, I hear it.
Yeah, we can hear it now.
Okay.
Faites un premier bilan. Allez vous rendre compte par vous-même. J'ai mis tous les moyens à votre disposition. Allez faire un tour et vous verrez ce qui se passe.
En tout cas, la grève semble avoir réussi.
Non. Elle a manqué son objectif principal.
L'insurrection?
L'insurrection.
Mais ce n'est pas une grève insurrectionnelle.
Et vous croyez aux affirmations du FLN?
Elle semble plausible cette fois-ci. Une grève générale est un bon argument pour l'ONU.
L'ONU est lointaine, cher monsieur. Comment peut-elle juger de l'importance d'une grève? Pour le FLN, il serait plus facile de se faire entendre avec les bombes. C'est ce que je ferai à leur place.
Qu'est-ce qu'une insurrection armée pourrait impliquer en ce moment?
Ce qu'implique toute insurrection armée. C'est un moment inévitable de la guerre révolutionnaire. Après une première phase de terrorisme, on passe à l'insurrection armée. C'est ainsi que de la guérilla, on passe à la vraie guerre.
Bien fou.
Précisément. En Indochine, ce sont eux qui ont vaincu.
Et ici?
Cela dépend de vous.
De nous? Auriez-vous l'intention de nous faire recruter, mon colonel?
Dieu m'en garde. Vous devez seulement écrire et, si possible, bien écrire. Des guerriers, il y en a plus qu'il n'en faut.
Qu'est-ce qui manque alors?
Une volonté politique qui parfois existe, parfois non. Parfois, elle est insuffisante selon les jours. Hier, que disait-on à Paris?
Rien. Un autre article de Sartre.
Qui peut me dire pourquoi les Sartres naissent tous d'un même côté?
Alors, Sartre vous plaît, mon colonel?
Non. Mais il me plaît encore moins de l'avoir comme adversaire.
In this sequence, a reporter asks Mathieu if the FLN's general strike wouldn't capture the attention of the UN, again underscoring the centrality of the international organization to the FLN's revolutionary strategy. Soon thereafter, the FLN's dedication to what they refer to as Third World revolutionary struggles is demonstrated by a reporter's allusion to Dien Bien Phu, a reference to the 1954 battle that humiliated the French military and hastened to the decolonization of French Indochina. Not only does this moment allow for a subtle jab at the French military, but it is consistent with Algerian foreign policy vis-a-vis revolutionary insurgencies. Dien Bien Phu may have occurred before the outbreak of the Algerian War, but the independent Algerian government turned its attention to the same geographical area in its frequent denunciation of the American presence in Vietnam. Finally, the sequence ends with a wry allusion to Sartre, thus recognizing the ability of European intellectuals to aid in the raising of international awareness of the struggle, much like Pontecorvo essentially did in collaborating in the Battle of Algiers. Like subsequent, it went out of full screen there, but I think we could still keep going. Like subsequent international co-productions taken up by the Algerians, the co-production of the Battle of Algiers provided Algerian technicians and craftsmen with experience that would allow them to cultivate Algeria's domestic cinema. According to Cinéma Production Cinématographique, an overview of Algerian film published by the Algerian Ministry of Information and Culture, Casbah Film regularly recruited Moussa Haddad as an assistant director for its international co-productions. Haddad worked under both Pontecorvo on the Battle of Algiers, as well as Luchino Visconti on The Stranger, a 1967 adaptation of the Camus novel co-produced by Casbah Film. In the decade that followed these films, Haddad became a director in his own right, working on projects in the Algerian film industry's two most successful franchises. Haddad would go on to helm Les Vacances de l'Inspecteur Tahar, one of the Algerian film industry's products most embraced by the domestic market. The film was so popular that it received a sequel in 1977. Haddad also had a hand in the Algerian film industry's other popular franchise. He directed Hassan Terro au Maquis, a TV movie that followed the comic revolutionary hero who made his first appearance in Mohamed Lakhdar Hamina's popular Hassan Terro in 1968. As it wended its way through the festival circuit, the Battle of Algiers garnered global prestige across the ideological spectrum. The film found its first major success at the 1966 Venice Film Festival, where it won the Golden Lion, the festival's top prize. According to Tino Ballio, the film played to a packed audience at the Philharmonic Hall at the 1966 New York Film Festival, a key event for international films to garner a reputation on the American art house market. It played at the London Film Festival to great acclaim soon thereafter. The film fared well in revolutionary circles of the Global South as well. In Sohail Dolatzai's thorough tracing of the film's global circulation, it is indicated that the film was embraced by Castro's Cuba and Palestine's PLO alike. Pontecorvo's and Yassef's film did not receive rapturous reception, unsurprisingly, in France, where the film was banned until 1971. But nevertheless, for a film that proudly bills itself in an initial title card as, quote, the first significant Algerian production, no international launch could have done more to demonstrate to the world that the fledgling national cinema had enormous aesthetic and political promise. As Casbah film earned the Algerian film industry's first major international successes, governmental organizations dedicated to film production and distribution began to coagulate and evolve. The most important and central filmmaking institution in Algeria was the ONCIC, or Office National pour le Commerce et l'Industrie Cinématographique. Under the purview of the government's Ministry of Information, the ONCIC was formed in 1967 as a reorganization of the dissolved CNCA, or Centre National du Cinéma Algérien. The ONCIC was closely managed by the government. The director of the ONCIC was appointed directly by the Minister of Information, and decisions involving staffing and production were subject to the approval of the ministry. Still, the first article of its constituting text allowed for collaborations with international third parties that would be subject in part to international laws. It was against this institutional backdrop that the Algerian government undertook co-productions with Italian and French companies alike. Films produced by Algeria in collaboration with other countries include Michel Drax's Elise, or Real Life, as well as Jean-Louis Bertuccelli's Ramparts of Clay. The most notable co-production between the ONCIC and a Western company, however, was Constantine Costa-Gavras' enormously successful 1969 film, Z. Like Pontecorvo, Costa-Gavras' filmography in the 1960s reflected ideological commitments that were consonant with the FLN's commitment to Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism. In 1967's Shock Troops, the film that immediately preceded Z in his filmography, Costa-Gavras presents the story of French soldiers who escape from a military prison and bitterly resist the occupying German forces. Just as an aside, who should appear as an actor in Shock Troops but Med Hondo, who would go on to direct Soleil, which was an important anti-colonial film. I believe 1970 was when that came out. The German occupation of France during World War II may seem distant from the cause of Algerian independence. In fact, many of the soldiers who fought in the resistance would fight the FLN's army as more seasoned officers. Nevertheless, as James D. Lesueur notes in Uncivil War, Intellectuals and Identity Politics during the decolonization of Algeria, many European intellectuals who abhorred fascism were also key proponents of anti-colonialism. Why are the Sarts always born on the other side? Lamented the Battle of Algiers, Colonel Mathieu. Again, with Z, Algeria was to enter into a co-production with a filmmaker who was undaunted by the prospect of taking on politically charged projects. A tense political thriller, Z chronicles the clashes that occurred between a leftist Greek pacifist movement and the military police of the Greek junta that ruled the country in the 1960s and 70s. At its outset, the film proudly announces in a title card that, quote, any resemblance to real events, to any living or dead persons, is not the result of chance. It is intentional. The true events that the story of Z intends to resemble involved the assassination of Greek pacifist leader Grigoris Lambrakis. Using vaguely fictional analogs, Z depicts the murder of Lambrakis at the hands of fascist thugs, before becoming a procedural film that traces the dogged investigation of a governmental magistrate as he slowly uncovers the roles that members of the military police played in the orchestration of the assassination. Z was co-produced along with Regan Films and Valoria Films in France. It may seem counterintuitive that a public institution in Algeria would enter into a collaboration with enterprises from a country that, not 10 years earlier, had tried to aggressively stamp out the revolutionary movement that would go on to form the basis for the independent government. Yet, while Algeria remains skeptical of the encroachment of Western culture in the immediate post-independence period, many in high levels maintained, according to historian Alistair Horn, an attitude summarized by the phrase, quote, "the page is turned." In a speech commemorating the third anniversary of his administration, President Boumediene outlined his vision for a peaceful, if uneasy, coexistence with France. Quote, "Most neutral observers did not believe that the two nations could cooperate after independence," Boumediene claimed. Quote, "Nevertheless, Algeria has chosen the way of forgiveness and tolerance, silencing resentment, drying her tears, and extending the hand of cooperation. The French have considerable interests in Algeria. These interests bring enormous dividends. Similarly, we have interests in France, where there are a large number of Algerian workers, in addition to the technical and cultural assistance granted as a result of Algeria's situation immediately after the colonial period." End quote. He went on to stress that the nature of such cooperation depended on the countries undertaking mutually beneficial commerce policies. In some industries, such as viniculture, strong tensions remained. Film production, however, was an industry that had the opportunity to benefit French and Algerian film professionals alike. International co-productions of political films like Z could also promote, if not the firm Arab nationalism that characterized the core beliefs of the ideological principles upon which the Algerian government was founded, then at least anti-imperial and anti-fascist ideas that were consonant with those ideological principles. In his memoirs, Costa-Gavras indicates that he became associated with the ONCIC largely through Jacques Perrin, the radical actor who both performed in and co-produced Z. According to Costa-Gavras, Perrin was well connected with Algerian cineasts and government officials alike. Through Perrin, both Mohamed Lakhdar Hamina and Sharif Belkacem championed the film. Belkacem was the Algerian Minister of the Economy, and Lakhdar Hamina was a wartime filmmaker who later became head of the Office des Actualités Algériennes, an institution that fell under the purview of the Ministry of Information. Through these connections, Costa-Gavras met Minister of Information Mohamed Sadiq Ben Yahia, who, upon greenlighting the production, agreed to offer technicians, filming authorizations, and hotel stays to the production team. Later, in a firm testament to the top-down governmental control of the Algerian film industry, Costa-Gavras learned that Lakhdar Hamina had even discussed the co-production with President Boumediene, who gave the film his blessing. Many sequences, such as the pivotal demonstration scene in which the Lambricus analog is felled, were filmed in Algiers. Indeed, this sequence in particular would appear to be ideologically significant. Though it does not treat the Algerian struggle directly, it nevertheless features some elements that are strongly consonant with independent Algeria's wartime history, as well as its post-independent culture.
C'est plus rigolo que le mois de chat, non? Rigolo, ça? C'est vraiment pour faire plaisir que je suis venu ici. Et t'es dans ce russe, c'est pas déjà vu? Ben, sauf quand t'es là qui choisit la liberté. Alors là, mon journal. Vous ne comprenez rien, vous comprenez la bombe, j'ai pas vu, c'est américain. Plutôt les banques des workers, victimes du fascisme.
First, any Algerian audience member of 1969 would recognize elements of the OAS in the thuggish behavior of the junta supporters. As we briefly discussed in Pontecorvo's unproduced film on the Algerian War, the OAS was a paramilitary organization that attempted to violently retain France's presence in Algeria in the final years of the war. In the junta-backed mob's assassination of the Lambrakis analog, there are echoes of, say, the OAS's gunning down of Algerian writer and intellectual Mouloud Faroun in 1962. But the sloganeering of the peace protesters also puts forth ideas that overlapped with the interests of the Algerian government. For example, the chants of plus de bases étrangères, meaning no more foreign military bases, speak directly to the sticky technicalities in France's decolonization of Algeria. One of the major points of contentious negotiation of the Evian Accords, the treaty that ended the Algerian War, involved the continued presence of French military bases, such as the large, strategically placed base at the port of Mers el Kebir. Again, the text of Z does not deal directly with the Algerian War, but it does echo moments of recent Algerian history and ideological sentiments pertaining to international relations. Just as Casbah film gave training opportunities to Moussa Haddad, so did the production of Z offer experience to Algerian technicians who would go on to direct government-funded films. Again, according to the Algerian government's Cinéma Production Cinématographique, both Gauti Bendadouche and Mohamed Bouamari worked on Z in the capacity of assistant directors. Not long after the release of Z, Bendadouche made films for the Algerian government. Particularly notable is Mort la Longue Nuit, which Bendadouche made with fellow ONCIC director Mohamed Slim Riyad. For his part, Bouamari eventually directed Le Charbonnier for the ONCIC in 1973. Again, Algeria's filmic international collaborations gave professional experience to subsequent generations of Algerian filmmakers. Like the Battle of Algiers, Z was a major success on the international festival circuit, again proving that international co-productions could bring global critical acclaim to the Algerian film industry. Unlike the Battle of Algiers, Z competed for the Palme d'Or at the 1969 Cannes Film Festival. In the United States, the film benefited from a successful distribution campaign guided by Donald Rugoff's Cinema 5. The film earned $16 million at the American box office alone, and it became one of only a handful of international films to be nominated for Oscars for direction, screenplay, and Best Picture. Z was the only African-produced co-production to attain that zenith until South Africa's District 9 scored the nomination in 2009. It would ultimately take home the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. In more revolutionary contexts, the Black Panthers held screenings of the film, and according to critic and filmmaker Paulin Vieira, the film played as part of the cinematic component of the key Pan-African Cultural Festival in 1969. Just as Casbah Film scored a major international success with its international co-production, so too did the government-run ONCIC, thus further enmeshing Algerian cinema with prestigious global film culture. As the 60s progressed, independent Algeria increasingly turned its attention towards fashioning itself as a political and cultural leader for the tiers-monde. When Ben Bella was swiftly and bloodlessly deposed by the military in 1965, the coup occurred concurrently with the key Afro-Asian Unity Conference. The steady increase in Third Worldist interest occurred in Algeria's cultural sector as well. After a suite of successful co-productions with Western film industries, there was also appetite among Algerian filmmakers to re-infuse filmmaking with the revolutionary spirit that characterized much of Algerian foreign policy. According to Lotfi Maherzi, the ONCIC was heavily criticized by Algerian film professionals for maintaining too much of a caractère commercial instead of the more radical tone that pervaded, say, the FLN's wartime documentaries. In 1970, the UAAV, or Union des Arts Audiovisuels, the industry's largest trade union, crafted a letter to the Ministry of Information denouncing the preponderance of Western co-productions. Mohamed Bouamari, himself one of the assistants on Z, told an interviewer that international co-production seemed, quote, seemed to sometimes supplant national production, thus creating a negative effect on our seventh art. He went on to tell the interviewer that, quote, we also wanted to turn our cinema to be reoriented towards Africa and the Third World. In a footnote, the interviewer editorializes that this was the spirit in which the ONCIC undertook co-productions with the Egyptian film industry, the first of which would be Youssef Chahine 1972 film, The Sparrow. Egyptian media had long found Algerian audiences in the colonial era and beyond. According to a 1956 set of statistics put out by the French Département d'Algérie, found in the Georges Sadoul papers at the Cinémathèque Française, 312 Egyptian films were shown in Algeria in 1955 and 1956, attracting over 1.2 million spectators. This accounted for about a ninth of all films distributed in Algeria that year, and as this falls after the outbreak of the war itself, probably represents a more restricted figure than the amount that were entering Algeria before 1954. With these figures, I think this also includes shorts. This number does seem a little high, but in reports like these also usually include short films and newsreels and stuff like that. So this figure does not only represent feature films, but I believe also other kinds of theatrically exhibited films as well. More important to the cause of Algerian nationalism, however, was Egyptian radio. As I discussed in the first chapter of the dissertation, the radio program, The Voice of the Arabs, a nationalist program run by the Egyptian government, enjoyed great popularity with underground members of the FLN during the revolution. Such nationalist media were closely affiliated with the government of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a forceful proponent of Arab nationalism and a central figure in Shahin's co-production with the post-independent Algerian film industry. For his part, Shahin's filmography offered what was in all likelihood global cinema's most full-throated endorsement of the cause of Arab nationalism. Whereas Pontecorvo and Costa Gabras had existing filmographies that promoted ideological positions that were consonant with Algerian political views, Shahin's films made before the Algerian co-productions put forth ideological positions that more or less overlapped with the Arab nationalism of the Algerian government. In 1963's Saladin, Shahin offers a biopic of the medieval sultan and military commander who repelled Catholic crusaders. With 1969's The Land, the Egyptian director depicts a group of peasants who come into conflict against rich landowners in Egypt of the 1930s. It is his 1958 film, Jamila the Algerian, however, that serves as the best testament to Shahin's dedication to the cause of Algeria's brand of Arab nationalism. Released when Algerian independence was still very much an open question, a full 4 years before the conclusion of the war, Jamila the Algerian tells the story of Jamila Bouhired, one of the Algiers operatives working under Saadi Yassef, who planted a bomb in a milk bar frequented by Europeans. With melodramatic pathos, the film goes on to present her apprehension and subsequent torture and trial at the hands of the French. Such films made Shahin an ideal collaborator for an Algerian film industry facing internal pressure in the late 60s to return to its revolutionary roots. In email correspondence, Shahin's nephew and co-producer Gabriel Khoury indicated to me that The Sparrow was initially to be produced by an Egyptian governmental group called Cinema Organization. Several months before the shooting was scheduled to begin, Cinema Organization canceled the production, forcing Shahin to seek support elsewhere. Shahin recounted these production woes to Ahmed Rashdi, the filmmaker who was then head of the ONCIC. Given the intense internal pressure the ONCIC faced to turn its attention away from the West, Shahin's imperiled project no doubt presented Rashidi and the ONCIC leadership with a well-timed opportunity. Here was a project that could be undertaken with a seasoned, respected director that would communicate ideological positions even more in keeping with the Algerian government's revolutionary worldview. The Sparrow details the misadventures of a journalist and young military captain as they track an elusive highway bandit. The moral core of the film arrives towards the end, in which the characters' stories are abruptly interrupted by the outbreak of the Six-Day War. The war began on June 5th, 1967, when Israel, outraged by Egypt's closing of the Straits of Tiran, attacked Egypt's military, hitting its aerial forces particularly hard. The war was brief, but it had substantial implications for Arab populations in the Middle East, including the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. At the end of the war, Nasser resigned in humiliation, only to be swept back into power by the widespread protests in support of his administration that The Sparrow depicts at its climax. Like Z, The Sparrow's narrative does not directly treat the Algerian War. Nevertheless, the ideology of Arab nationalism, an ideology that the FLN embraced tenaciously during the war and beyond, remains essential to the spirit of the film. So, and this falls towards the end, and it represents it depicts the. Sorry, I realize I should have been maybe translating those French subtitles, but she's basically saying as she's running through the streets that we'll continue to fight. All right, so in the film's climax, the main characters watch a television in shocked, rapt silence as Nasser resigns. It is then that Behia, one of the film's least political characters, begins running through the streets proclaiming her devotion to both Nasser and to Egypt. She is soon joined by chanting masses of Egyptians demanding the reinstatement of Nasser. In an interview with Guy Annabelle, Shaheen claims to have re-edited the film 5 times before its completion. Nevertheless, he maintained that the final sequence depicting the Egyptians demanding the return of Nasser was, quote, the fundamental aspect of the film, its basic idea. The entire story is structured in service of the final sequence. There are several reasons pertaining to international relations and foreign policy that might have motivated the government-aligned Algerian film industry to take on a co-production with such a finale. First, Nasser had been, since 1952, the world's most forceful and successful exponent of Arab nationalism, as well as an early ally of the fledgling Algerian rebellion in the mid-1950s, especially when it came to informational warfare. Next, in keeping with their steadfast commitment to global revolutionary struggles as a firm component of their foreign policy, the Algerians were, and if you read today's headlines in El Mujahid, clearly still are, dedicated to the cause of Palestinian nationalism. In the Algiers Charter, in fact, the Palestinians are one of the few populations mentioned by name in the section detailing the FLN's foreign policy. For these reasons, the climax of the text of the Sparrow illustrates its suitability as an international co-production that could promote Algerian stances on international relations. What?
John, this is great. I just it's 12:45, so
okay. Yeah,
maybe...
I can wrap up real quick.
It's great.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, there you see similar patterns in terms of training. So there in interviews there are cameramen, sound engineers who talk about how collaborations with Youssef Chahine were particularly important to them. And though the Sparrow didn't reach sort of the same heights in global prestigious film culture as the Battle of Algiers and Z, it did play at the director's fortnight. And of course, Youssef Chahine was very culturally well respected in all manner of sort of societal contexts. So at the Carthage Film Festival, for example, he received an award for his entire body of work, as opposed to just one particular film. I can open it up to questions now. Sorry for running a little long there. But thank you all for listening, and I appreciate your time. Your
time. Bravo. I just I just want to make sure we have some time for questions, and I apologize for
No, sorry for running a little long there.
So before does anybody want to start with a question for John on the Algerian co-productions? Any? I guess I can start. It's really rich looking at the co-productions in these years, and also thinking about the difference between a national production in Algeria and what that would symbolize for the new nation, and in the ways that they're trying to get their footing in this industry, and specifically with Kasbah Films. So maybe that's something that's open that I could ask you about. What do you feel, just in general, you could say about co-productions versus national productions in Algeria in these years, and what this, just as a general sweep, symbolizes?
So I would say that you see these co-productions sort of early on in terms of the Algerian film industry, and then you see national products for the domestic market sort of emerge, with the Wind of the Auras in 65, 66, and the sort of building steam into the 70s. Whoops, sorry, I accidentally turned on my Roomba there. The in terms of the differences between the co-productions and the domestic films themselves, I think in the early on in the late 60s into the early 70s, most of the domestic films like The Battle of Algiers deal with the independence struggle in some fashion. And then once you get to the early 70s, around when The Sparrow was released, you see domestic films in Algeria deal more with the sort of industrializing society, and how sort of characters navigate that sort of transforming world. So I'm thinking in particular of films like Sid Ali Mazif's Leila et les Autres, or a really outstanding film called Omar Gatlato by Merzak Alouache in 76. That you can find with English subtitles. It's on YouTube with English subtitles. Highly recommend. So those were the trends that I think you see these trends sort of evolving independently of one another in terms of Algerian international co-productions initially starting off with the West, and then gradually sort of refinding their revolutionary roots, whereas the evolution of the domestic products from the Algerian film industry go from representing the independent struggle to sort of showing characters having this malaise as they navigate an industrializing urban society.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Alouache's film Omar Gatlato, because that is a real critique of Algeria, I think, at that point, and showing the problems with housing and
Sure.
well, sex,
Right.
marriage, etc. So things have really moved away from looking at this repetition of the revolution that Alouache said he absolutely didn't want to do. Thank you for answering that question. Do we have another question?
The chat. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, in the chat, that was just me asking,
Okay.
soliciting questions. Opening this up to the audience.
I do wanna.
There is a question in the chat. Oh, sorry for cutting you off,
Wonderful.
Nicole. So we have a question from Vivian. I'm just going to read that out. Thanks so much for your research, which is very exciting. I'm also working on Algerian cinema currently, and on Shaheen's Jamila. So I am very happy to connect if you're interested. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your dissertation project more generally, and how has this chapter fit in?
Yeah, so in terms of the dissertation more generally, the scans that I circulated from the Roy Arms book, as well as the Dolitzai book, those I circulated those in particular because they sort of that's the sort of method that I'm following, a method that is that incorporates some post-colonial theory, but is largely driven by formal analysis and archival research that situates these films in various historical, industrial, and political contexts. So this is the period that I'm looking at involves the very first Algerian films, which were the documentaries that were made before independence. So things like Josiah Runa, some René Vautier films, Algerian Flamme, I believe is the title of his 1960 film. And then I follow the sort of evolution of these institutions until the dissolution of the ONCIC in the mid 1980s. So and the the within that period, I'm interested in how the Algerian film industry integrated itself into global film culture more generally. And this takes the form of things like celebrating Western productions. So you see that in, for example, the Algerian Cinematheque programming, genre noir movies, as well as film magazines like Les Deux Écrans, which was published in both French and Arabic. Promoting, having an interview with Fellini, but also promoting articles on more revolutionary cinema. And in fact, one thing that I plan on writing about again in the Georges Sadoul papers, the Algerian Cinematheque did this great program that was called essentially The Colonizer and the Colonized, where it would pick one sort of geographical area and show one film from the colonizer's perspective and one film from the colonized perspective. So that is, a sort of cinephile institution in Algeria that is programming international films from the West and and the global South alike. So it's in addition to talking about co-productions, I'll also be looking at documentary filmmaking, Algerian films on the international festival circuit in both contexts like Cannes and Venice and New York, but also places like the Algerian Cultural Festival in 1969, as well as the Carthage Film Festival in Tunisia. And then finally, the cinephile sort of culture, like I was discussing with film journals as well as the Algerian Cinematheque.
And it's also interesting, like thinking about the cinephile culture in Algeria, to think about that as heritage, legacy of French colonialism. How many? I forget the exact figure of how many cinemas were left in Algeria, but it's interesting. And
Right, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but yeah, that was, and the exhibition halls were the first component of the film industry to be nationalized.
Ahmed Benjawi talks a lot about that always.
And it's
in his
right in that the 2020 his 2020 book. Yeah,
I'm sure it's in there. Also,
yeah.
Okay, Vivian says, thanks so much. It's, yes, 400 plus screens, I believe.
Okay.
And Benjawi also is somebody who'll talk about how he was involved in cineclubs. So it's also a cineclub tradition. I wanna encourage you. It's interesting the way you framed Para, because I always think of Para not as a separate film that didn't get made as much as also a working almost draft that then was transformed into the Battle of Algiers after he met with Algerians. So I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just maybe I misframed it, or maybe that's a parallel way of looking at that, and that Paul Newman was going to be in it, and all of these things that he had to rewrite, and looking at so I know that Saidi wrote a draft of the Battle of Algiers based on his book, recounting of the events with René Vautier, and they gave that to Pontecorvo, and he completely nixed it and said, no, this is propaganda. And then he had his Para film, and then it was about finding that middle ground.
Right. When it definitely sort of, I think, primed Pontecorvo to sort of learn and know about like what was happening in Algeria. It definitely, the writing of Para with Franco Solinas certainly, I think, informed his views on Algeria. The differences between the stories is interesting in that Paras is more has that more sort of Aristotelian unity where you have a character sort of coincidentally show up at the end that the main character had encountered earlier, that you don't get quite as much of that in the Battle of Algiers. The Battle of Algiers is more sort of like these are the events as they happened. But you definitely see the groundwork being laid in Para for the Battle of Algiers.
Let's see what's going on.
This is great.
Will
So I think
has
we have one question from Will.
Yes.
John, do you know of any films that focus on the experience in France during the early 1960s? I can see that Joy has a recommendation there already. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
the
great.
Jacques Panigel film. So yes, there's that. The one that I would recommend, it's again on YouTube, and this is it's only with French subtitles. But it's called Ali au Pays des Mirages. That is about a construction worker who works in a crane in France. He's Algerian and works in France. And that is a really sort of striking representation of Algerian expatriates sort of navigating complicated life in France.
Could you type that out?
Yeah,
John?
absolutely. Mirage.
Yeah.
I'm
I
also
was,
going
I
to
was particularly
recommend La Belle Vie,
about the
which wasn't exactly, I don't know if it was exactly censored, but it's a veteran coming home to France, but it was put off a few years, I think, and was finally released in '64. And it has some really troubling, actually, sound flashbacks. So recommend that.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested because unlike most of you, probably all of you, I was alive at the time, living in France during the attempted coup. And so I saw it from a different point of view. There were French soldiers practicing with live grenades around my house, which was near an Air Force base. And while I was watching a movie in the Parisian theater, a plastique went off in the front. So terrorism, of the OAS was very much alive for the average Frenchman and French woman. So I was curious to see how that, not necessarily the Algerians, but the ordinary French citizens.
When you say the coup, is that the putsch that
we were expecting parachutes to come down and attack us any moment. It was very real to us.
And it's so funny too, the amount of assassination attempts that de Gaulle survived. I mean, it's almost like a Looney Tune. Like he's almost like Roadrunner, and Wile E. Coyote he somehow manages to survive.
And I remember one issue of Newsweek appeared with the cover blacked out because de Gaulle didn't want Salan's face to be showing.
Raoul Salon. Wow.
I was just typing it, but I'll just say it. I mean, it's also interesting to reassess the new wave as being about this, as Joy is shaking her head, about this collapse of the empire and loss of Algeria and war and draft that's taking place at the same time. And so like little mentions like you find in Cleo from 5 to 7 become more important. And then like Godard's film, The Little Soldier, it's so obvious, but there are a lot other sort of references that you can
in French New Wave movies you sort of get two kinds of representations. You get the sort of Cleo from 5 to 7 or Umbrellas of Cherbourg where it's sort of like backdrop, And then you get movies like Muriel or Alain Cavalier's. It has different titles, but The Unvanquished with Alain Delon that sort of confront that stuff more head on.
Yes. It's a
One
great conversation. Do we have any more questions? So are you're gonna present at SCMS in Boston, correct?
Incorrect. So I
Oh.
actually will be I actually will be in France. So I was
Oh, good
fortunate
for
enough to,
you.
yes, I was fortunate enough to get a grant from the French government, the Chateaubriand fellowship to
Nice, that's amazing.
spend the semester over there. So as soon as my plan was to go on Tuesday, as soon as I get I get my visa, there's paperwork problems with the visa. So I'll be there in the next couple weeks at the latest.
Well,
That's
John,
wonderful.
tell us what you're going to be doing there.
Yeah, so I'll be just expanding on some of the archival research that I did last summer. So specifically at the Centre Culturel Algérien, the Cinémathèque Française, and then I'll hopefully go to Nantes to look at some of the diplomatic papers there. And then as I'll sift through some materials at the Bibliothèque Nationale. There's some people there who I would like to chat with as well. I have his email. I would love to chat with Costa Gavras. In fact, I have it. I have it right here. His memoirs and I'm also hoping to chat with. So Guy Hennebel was a key sort of engagé critic who lived in Algeria after independence, and his wife was also a critic, and she's still alive. So I'm hoping to be able to chat with her as well.
What's her name again?
Her name is Monique. I have the book over there. It's Monique, I believe Monique Martin Annabelle.
I met her, and
Oh.
she's really, really sweet. So it'll be a good experience. I can already
Good. Glad to hear.
that. What I wanted to also say, I'm like, my mind is drawing a blank as usual, but I know that it might also be something to consider going to the René Vautier Cinémathèque.
Okay.
Going to Britannia. It seems like that might align with your research.
Very much so, because René Vautier is so funny. He's just like he is everywhere, and he like his memoirs. He's just got this fun sort of style in his memoirs. And it's so funny that he was like arrested by the French, and then when he gets out, he goes to Algeria. And he makes a few movies for the FLN, but then is arrested by the FLN, and then for on suspicion of being too Marxist, and then spends some time in jail, I believe, in Tunisia.
You'll find lots of different opinions on him
Yes,
as you
I
continue
bet.
your research. But I do know
Nicole, just wanted to mention
Cinémathèque is
maybe it's a good idea to
we're gonna wrap.
stop the recording, and then we can continue
Yeah. I
off
apologize.
off the recording. Yeah.